Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this experience with you.
Yeah, I'm so excited to do this together. I'll give folks a little bit of an introduction about who you are, in case they haven't read your Substack yet or seen your work. But Kelley is a nationally recognized transition specialist and the founder of Challen Education and Transition Services, where she helps teens, college students, and young adults with diverse learning and developmental profiles plan for meaningful futures. With more than 20 years of experience in transition assessment, planning, program development, and consultation, Kelley specializes in helping students clarify goals, build real world skills, and bridge the gap between high school and adult life. Kelley also authors the Planning Beyond the IEP Substack, which I love, where she shares insights on college readiness, self determination, and navigating the path from school to adulthood. So I'm so excited to talk today a little bit about transition planning and kind of where our work overlaps in some ways too, that transition from high school into adulthood. So, I know you've spent over 2 decades doing this work and helping people navigate sort of those major life transitions. And I'd love to hear, how did you get into the work and really how has your work evolved over this time?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. And it's funny, you talk about spending 2 decades in a field, and we both do, some career counseling with people. And we always talk about elevator speeches. And I think the thing that's hardest for me is to condense how I got to where I am in my career because it wasn't a direct path. And that's something that I think is so important for us to share with people, right? Career paths are not direct. What you're doing at 22 is definitely not what you're doing at 42 or 62. For me, I was a psychology major in college and really kind of looking to get a little bit of experience that would help me to get into grad school. And so I started working at summer camp programs for neurodivergent, children actually back then. And I just kind of fell in love with the kids I was working with, right? I loved, um, I don't know. I love different things about being logical, being routine, like good senses of humor, like all sorts of things. And so that didn't pull me fully in this direction. I still applied to graduate school and did some practicums around guidance counseling, school counseling, and I worked at Boston Latin School, which sends a lot of students to very prestigious colleges. And so I was very into college counseling. But then I was also doing this summer work with a range of students with disabilities. And believe it or not, after grad school, I could not get a job, which happens, right? Couldn't get a job as a guidance counselor. So I ended up taking a job at one of the summer camp programs I had been working with, who was looking to develop programming for teenagers and for young adults, and really specific programming helping students with this transition to college and transition to employment. And it was amazing. And that really sent me on a different path of thinking about how do we help all sorts of individuals plan for life after adulthood. Eventually, I went to a different nonprofit and did sort of similar work. And then I was hired at a neuropsychology practice where I got to work with a lot of brilliant individuals who did a lot of diagnosing. And then I brought in that lens of, okay, here's who you are, a little bit more about yourself. How do we think about what you want to do in the future and how you plan for the future? And I feel really lucky that my sort of nonlinear path brought me to where I am. I think I get to use all the different experiences I've had, all the different education that I've had. And I just really love working with individuals around thinking about the future from whatever point they're at right now. So I work with students who are in middle school, and obviously how you think about your future as a middle schooler is very different than when you're
Totally.
25 or 28. So I feel lucky to do what I do.
Wonderful. Well, you and I share a lot of similarities kind of in that space. And it's part of the reason I arrived too in this sort of world of educational consulting and helping families find the right schools. And then also on the adult side, being on sort of the career coaching side, because I also had sort of a long and winding path. I also got my bachelor's degree in psychology. I went and worked in neuroscience labs for a period of time, actually for a neuropsychologist who was also doing NIH-funded neuroscience research, and did that for a while. Went and taught in the classroom, got my master's degree in education, went and worked in workforce and sort of career development services in
Yeah.
higher ed for a decade. And so, you and I both have had sort of that really broad, interesting experience of seeing people at different life stages. And I think it's part of the reason you and I both have that passion for that sort of transition space that often gets left out. So kind of my next thing I really wanted to ask you is, when we think about preparing children and teens for adulthood, we often focus on what's happening here and now. We're not so focused on sort of the future, whatever's going on in the current school year or even the current month, rather than sort of that transition to adulthood. So, why do you focus on transitions specifically?
I think, I mean, for a few different reasons, I think you probably run into this in your work too. I work with students, and a lot of times the kids that I'm working with need to know why why we're working together. Like, why bother? Like, what's the point of whatever skill or whatever conversation we're happening? So, honestly, I think it's a more practical approach to take with young people when part of what the process is to think about, like, well, what do you want? Like, what is something you want in your future? And some kids have super specific goals. I really want to be, in biotechnology and work in a research lab. And other students, it's like, I just don't want to live with my parents anymore, right? Like, they're very different.
Sure.
Very different kinds go, or like, I want to be able to buy any kind of candy I want, right? Like, I'm thinking of a really younger student, but once you can get kids talking about like what is motivating to them, what they are interested in, then I feel like you have a lot more credibility, you get a lot more buy-in, and then kids are excited to be learning new things, building new skills, developing new knowledge, right? If we're only focused on like what's going on right now, what are you doing wrong? What do we need to fix? It's not a very fun or exciting or engaging or motivating way to work with young people. So I think it just fit really naturally because it's useful, right? Like, it's just a really easy way to get students to buy in, and it's different than what a lot of other adults do with kids. So I think people enjoy coming for transition assessment or transition planning or transition coaching because it's a really different way of working with young people. So
Yeah, I mean, it's so needed. I think it's part of the reason I started kind of being in the space that I'm in too, is I was doing a lot of work of supporting kids and then career coaching with adults. And it was like there's a long space between those two things, and a lot of ways to kind of move the needle in the trajectory for people along the way if we just have thoughtful sort of planning along that path. And there was really good data that came out this year from the Mensa Foundation, where they had done a study with, particularly with gifted and twice exceptional adults, asking them really what they needed and wish they had had around career planning. And a huge piece of it was really thoughtful career planning that was tailored to the way that their brains work too. And I know you and I are both really thoughtful about that, about working with people to find the transition that's actually going to fit who they are too, rather than just doing sort of like generic college counseling, that sort of thing. So tell me a little bit, you and I both do individualized assessments, planning, coaching, consulting, all these kind of strategies to move folks forward. So what are maybe some tools or approaches or strategies that you consistently like to use to get people to where they're going?
yeah. So I want to talk about the tools, but I want to back up just to the framework that I use, which has a lot to do with the kind of assessment that I use. And so, one of the other things, specifically as a transition specialist and thinking about transition planning, is that I'm focused on career, but not just career, right? When I work with young people, we really think about holistic planning, or older people. And so what I love about the transition sort of lens is we're looking at like what learning or training kinds of experiences might make sense. What career, interests and aptitudes and skills or goals do you have for yourself? But also, like, how do you want your independent life to look? Do you want to live by yourself? Do you want to live with other people? Do you want to, like, where do you think you actually are going to end up in the universe, right? And how do you want to be engaged as part of your community? And so I'm, picking out assessment tools and talking with students constantly about life in a holistic way and not in sort of a tracking sense. I think there can be such a focus on college, college, college. We're going to get into college. What are you going to major on in college? Without actually connecting that to like what else is going to happen in your life? What are the social benefits of being a college student, right? Like, how does networking matter as an adult? Not just like getting through academics and that academics are the end all be all. Because at the end of the day, I mean, I'm excited that I have a job where I can still learn, right? But we don't spend a lot of our adult life in formal academic environments. And so if that's the only focus of what we're trying to be successful with, I think that really isn't super helpful. And as you said, right, we need to be like individualizing to who the person is and kind of specializing our planning to take into account all of who that person is. So I guess, you know, I think there are a lot of different wonderful assessment types of tools to use with students. And I feel like it's not so much, I mean, there are tools that I'm like, oh, I love this tool, right? But
Sure.
but it's not so much to me about like which tools you're using. I think it has a lot to do with how you engage the young person that you're working with around those tools. And sometimes we have to talk about like this is a standardized test. So you're going to see you're going to see questions on here and think, I just answered that question 5 minutes ago. Why do I have to answer that again? But even explaining like how standardized tests work and why it is really important to answer the same question 6 different ways, and it's just like, yep, we have to do this. Um, but I think also talking with young people afterwards about like, here's how this came out. Like, what do you think about these results? Does this seem accurate for you? What parts seem accurate? What parts don't? How do we take these couple of different tests that we've, done over multiple sessions and actually put that information together? Here's what this is leaning towards. Let's do some research around that. I think it's really about making assessment relevant for the person you're working with. So many times kids we work with are like tested and then they're tested again and then they're tested again and nobody ever explains what the results mean. So I also
Yes.
spend a lot of time talking with my students about other tests they did with other people and like did anyone ever tell you about that result? Have you ever actually seen how these scores came out? Do you have any idea what it means if this score is a lot higher than that score and how that might be really frustrating in your day? So I think it's just really engaging young people as partners in this process. I mean, if anything, as drivers in this process, because it's their life, their goals, their test results. And I think that that's what tends to be effective and make a difference, right? Is putting some of the ownership and eventually all of the ownership on the person. Because
Yeah, that's a really great point. I often hear that from people kind of on the gifted side of things where they'll do testing, they're brought in for some random testing in elementary school, they're then shoved in a certain classroom or like pulled out for a few hours a day, or they go somewhere to some special thing and they have no context really for why they're there. Their parents aren't even necessarily notified. Here in Colorado, I was working with a family and they were like, we got these results in the mail that our kid is highly gifted. And we were like, I don't know what this is. I didn't even know my kid did testing. Like, what does this even mean? Right. And so a lot of my work is contextualizing that too, of like,
Mhm.
it's not just that your kid is a really fast learner, it's that your kid's probably got some of these other things going on too. And I'm sure you've got to do some of that too with families. And I think you and I both in the work that we do, we're thinking expansively about kids' futures and adults' futures. You had a really great post, I think it was a month or two ago, about all sort of the other options that you can go into as an adult too. That it's not just you have to go straight to college. There's a lot of other really viable options for people, and I've been thinking lately that's a lot of the work that I do too is sort of that paradigm shifting for people too. Yeah, a lot of times the idea is like you go to school, you go in this really linear fashion into a certain job, and then there can be disappointment when that doesn't quite work out, or when that linear path disappears because AI took over your job that you were planning on forever, or all those sorts of things. And so I think where I'm kind of taking this is I'm wondering, for families who had these expectations that we were going to go a certain direction for their kid, or their kid was going to end up in a certain place or go to the Ivy League that they went to, or those sorts of things. How do you help reframe success for these families, particularly if they have, a child who's had a lot of challenges or disappointment in school, or even just sort of that grief that a child's path isn't what you expected it to be?
Yeah. I mean, I think it gets really complicated because, like as a parent, when anything is a little bit different than what you had hoped for your child, there is legitimate grief there, right? And I think I don't think we should take that away from parents. Like, it's a hard experience when you have hopes and dreams, for another human being, and things are different. And some of our brains deal better with being flexible than others. I'm not a particularly flexible human. So I take that really hard when something's quite different than I expect it to be. So I think it's important to acknowledge and honor and sit with that. And like, I think it's also important to talk about data. I do try to like go
Mhm.
back and help families really be grounded in what real college statistics look like. You know, sometimes we're very focused on students getting into school and they're going to be through school in 4 years. And that's actually like just not true. When we look at national data time and time again, you know, it's under 50% of students who enroll in a 4 year college for the first time that are actually going to finish college in 4 years. It's between 60 and 70%. It might be like 62 or 64% that will actually finish a 4 year degree in 6 years. And it's
Wow.
under a third of individuals who are going to, you know, finish college at the college where they started. So we don't talk a lot about those statistics. And the truth is, you know, there are variations in the kind, you know, how different kinds of learners are going to approach that. But I feel like we need to talk a lot about the reality. We also have really good statistics on students who take gap years or have gap experiences or have work experiences before we go to college. We know that that can increase your chances of success. So I try to make some of the lesser known data points more transparent for families because I think that can help, right? Like when you understand more about what a realistic path is going to potentially look like for your young person, sometimes that can help you to be more accepting of you know how things might be different than you pictured, but how that might actually be a better path, right?
Yeah.
There's also just, again, I always go back to, I'm like, well, let's do some life skills checklists. Let's do some college readiness checklists, right? Like, you tell me where you think the strengths are and where some of the still growing edges are. And a lot of times when families are filling those things out, or when we're talking realistically about like what are possible and reasonable accommodations at a college level and what are not, I think that parents you know, many parents, like, they are the most accurate, interpreter of their students, and when they start to really look at, "Oh, okay, here's what it takes, here's you know, here's what kinds of skills still aren't developed," they can come to that conclusion, but you really need to, like, sit with the emotional experience and take the
Yeah.
time to go down the path. I mean, it's kind of the same way I work with students, right? I don't just tell people, "Yes, you can do that. No, you can't do that." I say, "Okay, let's
Right.
like research what it would take to do that. Let's think about what skills and knowledge you have and let's see how those things match up." And I think there is just parents these days are so much more bombarded with misinformation than with true
Mhm.
information about what's possible, about what's realistic, about what's reasonable. I mean, social media, if anything, right, just reflects all of these fantastical kinds of things. Um, and that's not helpful in terms of us knowing like what are realistic pathways for our kids and what are reasonable timelines and what's okay and not okay. And it just there are so many positive reasons to really think about the transition from high school to college and you know in a stair step or in a winding sort of a pathway and put some experiences in between. It also helps students in the longer run to know more about themselves, to be more employable, to not have to switch majors 5 times during college. um,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess I just try to always give as much reality as I can, in the doses that parents and families can handle. Do you have
Yeah.
how do you what's your approach, Emily? Because I'm sure this comes up just as much in your practice.
Yeah, so I created a career framework. It came out of kind of my work with gifted and 2E folks, but I really used universal design principles so it's accessible to people even if you have intellectual disability, if you've got learning differences, all those sorts of things. Um, It's called the Curious Career Framework. And, sort of what you were talking about with experimentation, one of the major sort of cornerstones of that framework is that we engage in thoughtful, low stakes, playful experimentation around career. And we do that early and often. So rather than it being like, you're going to meet with me and we are going to find your one singular path for the rest of the future, it's like, hey, who are you today? What seems interesting today? Maybe we're not ready for a 4 year degree. Maybe we're ready for community college. Maybe we're not ready for community college. Can we take a class? Let's try a class out, right? And obviously that kind of depends on who your kid is. It's interesting because you were talking about that grief aspect, and I've had the opposite side happen too, where families are radically accelerating their child because their child is ready to skip a grade or two. And nobody talks to you about sort of the emotional fallout and the grief of like your child potentially going to college at 16 or 15, and what that can feel like for families too when they're expecting to have like their child in their house for a longer period of time, or or they have to really radically like change their lives around to be able to accommodate what it means to have a 15-year-old at college. Sometimes it's like it may not even be sort of that radical, but like your 14-year-old wants to take a class at the local community college. What does that mean on scheduling for like getting families there and those sorts of things too? So just wanted to acknowledge that piece as well. But I think back to kind of the framework, it's very methodical, kind of each of the steps. The first step in it is really clearing myths. That's what the C in curious stands for. And that's about cognitions, those faulty cognitions that get in the way for us of like, I'm no good at this job. I can't do that. Or the only job that's worthwhile is being a doctor, or, sort of these faulty beliefs that get in the way, like you're talking about, where like we have to get kind of some grounding about what's, again, data, what's the reality of the job market out there. U is for unearthing our sparks. So we're talking about values alignment. So a lot of times, people follow careers that, they're interested in it from a hobby perspective, or it's something that, they're interested in the topic of that career, but that doesn't always hold people's interest, and it's not always the right values sort of for people too. So we think broader about values alignment, because that means throughout your career, you can pivot a lot if you're following
Yes.
sort of your North Star, sort of your value, rather than, the one track mind kind of we always had. R in that framework is reflecting and realigning, and that's really sort of the getting real with the market. So that's looking at like occupational data out there, saying what's actually, what are people hiring for? What can I get paid for? I is iterating, and that is, I think, the most powerful step. And that iterating is doing those little job experiments. So we're getting out there, we're trying out things. Again, we're thinking about the world of work perhaps differently than just like applying to a bunch of those sort of like 40-hour-a-week jobs, where you have to try to fit yourself into that mold. Instead, we're thinking about how do you make work for you, particularly if you are neurodivergent or you're differently wired in some way. So it may be things like freelancing, or thinking about sort of a portfolio of work. So instead of one straight occupation, are you doing something for 10 hours a week and something else for another 10 hours a week? And then kind of we round that all out with OUS on curious, which is optimizing for usability and sustainability. And so that's really work-life balance, thinking about accommodations. How do we make sure that people fit, again, within the work environment, they're in a place where it can feel sustainable. They're not constantly burning out. They're not constantly going
Yes.
upstream because they have executive function challenges that just don't fit with whatever workplace they've landed in. So I really use a comprehensive framework. I have an assessment I developed, Curious Career Index, that tells me kind of where people are at. So when people come into my practice, it's one thing that we do is they take the index, and then we say like, this is an area, you really need to work on sort of these cognitions, or you need, you're somebody who you've got lots of great ideas, but you've never tried any of this. So like, let's try it and get some real data back from that too. So
Yeah.
it's, again, flexible. I adapt it to different folks. I have various assessments I use too, just like you do. But I approach it really from sort of that neurodivergent perspective
Yeah.
too, because which is very different than traditional career counseling.
I love a lot about that. But I was just thinking about what you said. I talk to a lot of students about that possibility of starting out or trying, that you may have more than one job, that not all of us
Yeah.
land in more than one job, right? And in fact, I almost ended up in two part-time jobs out of grad school when I was having a hard time finding that next job. And nobody talks about that with young people, right? It's always, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like, you're going to be one job and that is your whole existence. And I think it's really empowering to think about, you don't have to just do one job. You could do some freelance work. You may be somebody who really wants to be in a helping or a socializing profession, but you may burn out doing that more than a few hours per day or more than a few days per week. And so that doesn't mean that you don't get to do any of that work. Like, you may be able to combine experiences that are really meaningful for you into sort of like a more full lifestyle. But just like we talk about college, like it's 4-year college or it's nothing, there are so many different ways to learn and train, but there are so many different ways to be somebody who works and who has, different careers and different identities in the world. And we really don't talk about that enough. So I love that that's quite built into the framework that you're using with individuals. And I think that's especially important with individuals who are neurodivergent or individuals who have like really strong talents, that maybe, um, only want to do those in a burst or
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
it's very much an accessible framework for people sometimes have too many interests. They have, 15 different
exactly.
things they want to do. And, that can be almost as hard. Narrowing it down can be almost as hard
Yeah.
as also not having any interests at all. You've got similar but different problems kind of with that too. So the freedom to think that, what I'm doing today is but one chapter in a book of my life, and that tomorrow may look very different. I always like to sort of conceptualize it that way because it certainly was true for my career. And there's also good data on this too, that people
Yes.
who go out and try different things actually end up being better at their ultimate specialty if they end up specializing in something. They also bring really diverse perspectives to the workplace
Hmm.
because they've done things like I have where they've worked in the private sector, they worked in nonprofit settings, they've worked in universities, they were, getting kind of that information, you end up seeing more of the entire landscape than just being sort of, maybe an HR professional who has gone from the first level to the second to the third and so on and so forth. And so, I think moving from a place where we valorize specialization and instead saying like the generalist has a lot of value to bring to the
Yes.
workplace, particularly in the world of work in the future. I think that's the other thing too.
Yes.
You know, AI is rapidly changing what the world of work looks like for us, particularly in the US. We've had a lot of economic disruption, we've got a lot of things happening. And I think the sort of quote unquote winners of the future are going to be those who can shift, who can make changes. And in order to do that, you have to have had a variety of different experiences. So,
Yes.
prioritizing, again, broad experience over specialization, I think can be really valuable.
And
So
just
when
getting
you think about,
started.
oh, yeah,
I was like, just start with anything, right? Like,
exactly. Just choose somewhere. And you get really valuable data from that too. That's the other thing that I think,
yes.
especially like really bright folks, sometimes we can get in our heads and we just, we think about it and kind of overthink it, right? And we don't actually launch into trying something. And I think on the opposite side of that, sometimes parents will dissuade their children from trying things. So they'll say, "Oh, you're not good at that," or "That's not your skill strength," or "That's not, the place where you have your strong suit." And so we move from this place of like getting out of our heads into actually trying things because you get real data from trying things. You may realize you really don't like working in a kitchen or you really don't like doing this sort of thing. And that's important data for sort of that self-discovery too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess maybe tell me a little bit. I'm curious about, maybe a light bulb moment where, a client that you worked with where they finally saw a future that was possible for themselves.
So I tell this story a lot, and like people may have different reactions, but I think one of my most important light bulb moments was a student that I worked with, middle school, high school, gifted student, right? And this happens when, um, I think. When you're gifted, there's a lot of pressure, right? There's a lot of pressure that comes from parents. There's a lot of pressure that comes from yourself. Like somehow that label um, all of a sudden it just means you're going to do amazing things in the universe. And you are, but I feel like how we define amazing things in the universe, right, needs to be flexible. We all have different gifts to give and different things that are going to kind of fill our cups. And so everything about this student's high school experience and then did it one PG year was just all about like, how is the student going to get through the college and the PhD experience that they need to get through? And
Mhm.
honestly, the best thing that ever happened was needing to take a mental health leave in college and needing to then think about what to productively do during that mental health leave. And this student took a job at Starbucks. The
Oh,
student was absolutely never happier than, having that job at Starbucks and started off with like a very entry level position. But it was the first time the student felt socially successful. They ended up like just getting to engage around themselves, their interests, like daily life, pop culture, right? Like not around academic ventures. Ended up, working up to being an assistant store manager there, and that's not what the student's still doing today, but it was life changing and aha in terms of like, I have something to contribute. I am valuable. I can connect with people because it wasn't this sort of continued push around academics, which just honestly always felt like too much pressure. Um,
yes.
And it was a break from that pressure. And it was something the student perceived was going to be easy for them. And then, yeah, it was. But like there were challenges that came up and there, other things. And as they sort of worked up to other job roles, there were different challenges, but it was a place where the individual thrived. And I do think, which I'm sure has a lot to do with why you love doing the employment coach, it's like work experiences are just different than other experiences we have in life. We get to feel valued. We get to feel like we're contributing. You go to math class in college and like it doesn't really matter. The professor can teach that class if you're there, if you're not there. Even if you're the most gifted student in class, it can be taught without you. But like you don't show up at work, that matters. And if you do show up at work and people are telling you like, man, we're so glad you were here today, or we're so glad you picked up this extra shift. We couldn't have done this without you, right? Like it's just different. And so I guess I've seen a lot of those light bulb and aha moments when students have had work experiences, whether those are volunteer or internship or paid, as opposed to that, a lot of those light bulb moments come like sitting in the office or in academic settings. Although sometimes you do get the student who just like takes a class and that like changes their entire trajectory. But it's
Yeah.
experiences, right? It's having. And I love that idea of those, what did you say? Playful and exploratory or
Yeah, yeah. Thought experiments.
yeah,
Exactly. Playful, low stakes, just getting out there and trying things.
right. Yeah, just trying something that, might create a spark or that's related to, a feeling spark you have. I feel like those are the things that really are the light bulb moments for young people.
Yeah, yeah. It's such a good point too. Particularly kids who've received some sort of label, whether their label was dyslexic or their label is gifted or their label is autistic. Sometimes those labels can really limit kids, right? If we come to identify too closely with those labels, and I think the world of work, like you said, is sort of agnostic in a lot of ways about your label. Sometimes you have to show up and do the work that's expected that everybody else is expected to do, right? And I think you're right that sometimes work can be a place of relief for those of us who've been given certain labels if we can find a job that jives with us in some way. And again, I like to work with families around that piece because sometimes it's hard for parents to let go of the expectation one way or another, right? It's like my kid was always in the gifted program. Like I'm not okay with them working at Starbucks. They need to be doing blah blah blah. And I'm always like, let's pull it back and say, what brings your child meaning? What feels like a joy for your child in their life? Does this bring them a sense of competence? Those things are more important, frankly, than whether or not your child goes to Harvard and becomes a virtuoso and those sorts of things. And I think about that too from the perspective of intellectual disability too. If obviously there is grief if your child is not going to have the same trajectory that maybe you did or you expected them to have. But at the same time, can we focus on the strengths of this person in front of us and think about what do they have to contribute to society and how do we align them best with a space where again, jobs can be sort of confidence building. Jobs can be a way for us to build identity. I think, outside of sort of the capitalist structure, like work brings a lot of us meaning. And so if you can help people find meaning in their jobs, I think that's one of those valuable things you can do.
And I think we have so many adults with disabilities that are unemployed. And actually, autism in particular happens to be one of our more underemployed or unemployed adult populations, even more so than, some of our individuals with mild intellectual disability, right? And I think, some of that can be because we're spending so much time trying to target these sort of like expectations and like trying to achieve as opposed to like, let's just get started. Let's try the job. I think this happens a lot in my experience. I'm working with teenagers and we're doing, talking about first jobs and everybody, the idea of bagging groceries always comes up, right? And you get parents who are like, well, my kid can do more than bag groceries. And I'm like, absolutely your kid can. But like most of the other teenagers right now are bagging groceries. So like this is a great starting place to just do what other kids do. And that's not me stating that this is what your child's going to do forever, but sometimes, getting started with something that's age appropriate or developmentally appropriate or a good entry level starting point is a sensible thing to do instead of holding out for, the PhD level job without having ever had any other employment experience. I mean, there's so
Yeah.
much that you gain just through having a first job. Um,
Yeah.
and and
Yeah.
and having success with a job um and so I mean I also, as we were talking about a little bit before, it's like your first job is not the job you're going to do forever, right? I mean,
Mhm.
there are plenty of you know graduates who are making six-figure salaries who worked in jobs that were pretty basic when they were younger, and that's a good thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, well, and I think about it too, many of us land in roles that are quote unquote prestigious, or they are the high paying roles or the sort of high powered roles, and we're miserable, right? And so I think our sort of single minded focus on these roles of eminence in a lot of ways isn't necessarily how people are going to have the most meaningful lives, too. I think, there's lots of ways to structure that. And I think we do a disservice to teens and high schoolers in particular by making them think, there's really only one way to approach all of this. So I'm curious from you too, what do you wish that educators or parents or employers better understood about supporting neurodivergent people who are in transitions or coming into those workplaces?
Oh,
Yeah,
um,
I know it's hard to pick one.
yeah, I mean, I guess the most important thing to understand, and if you don't, right, if you're not specializing in this area, if you're not working in this area, is just and this is like a famous quote. It's like if you've met one neurodivergent individual, it's like you've met one neurodivergent individual, and if you had like a
Yeah.
family member, a nephew, a cousin, whatever, you had one previous employee that really isn't going to tell you a lot about
Yeah.
the next neurodivergent individual that you are teaching or supervising or working with. And I think, it's important. I guess it's just the other thing I would say is um, don't make assumptions, and don't be afraid to ask questions, right? If if you're in an interaction that isn't going well for whatever, like don't be afraid to just ask, like, did you know XYZ? And if the other person did know, great. And then they've made a choice. But if they didn't know, it's a good thing to ask and just not make assumptions. So I think it's don't overgeneralize from one human being to another human being, but also like don't be afraid to just ask very direct kinds of questions. And I feel like it's tricky, right? We are socialized in a lot of ways to not be very direct or not ask
Yeah.
questions or not, not to not, ask something that might be embarrassing or whatever else. But if avoiding a direct question is increasing some sort of poor performance or poor behavior or poor social relationship or dynamic in the office, just ask the direct kinds of questions and share
Yeah.
accurate, logical information. I mean, this is sort of a massive tangent, but when I think back to my practicum experience in grad school and working at Boston Latin School, I had this supervisor who was a guidance counselor who was just incredibly direct with students. And I remember we had a student who wasn't neurodivergent, but just was a student who had a body odor issue, right? And he would come to school every day and everyone was noticing his body odor. And 0 people were addressing it and taking it face on. And I remember her having this student in the office and just saying, like, "I'm sure you're not aware of this, but I don't know if you know, like, I can smell your body odor right now in this small space, and I'm sure you're not aware of this because if you were aware, I'm sure you'd wanna, like, do something different about that," right? And in that moment, he could have said, like, "Oh, no, I know, and I don't care." But but and not even then great, we've addressed it, we move on, but he wasn't aware, like, he had no idea, and so, like, we are so socialized to not say anything in that situation, but everyone is noticing. It was it was a social problem, it could have been eventually a career problem, and it was really nice to have, to early in my career have a supervisor who just addressed it in a very human way and a very like, hey, maybe you didn't notice this, but I want to let you know. And then for him, that was a pivotal moment. And it was like, okay, if he wanted more support or, understanding of what he could do different with his hygiene routine, like the door was then open. And I think you can very much do that as a when you treat people with respect, but you're also honest, a lot can be accomplished. So I think that's so important is to not make assumptions and just be honest and direct.
Such a good point. I've managed teams of 15 plus people at various points in time, and my philosophy has always been that direct feedback said with respect and kindness, and often privately pulled into my office to talk to do something, is actually the kinder thing to do, right? The cruel thing to do is to have them go out, everybody be gossiping about their performance that isn't going well or whatever is happening, and nobody saying something to them. Having those direct conversations, again, privately, with respect, with positive feedback, those sorts of things can give them the opportunity to improve or to change what's going on. And particularly for neurodivergent folks in the workplace, where, like you said, like people don't speak literally, there's all these politics that are hard to decipher. Being able to help them navigate those things, again, through sort of those private conversations, I think is a real kindness to people. And like all things, the things that work well for people who are neurodivergent often work well for the rest of us too, right? Like when we
Yes.
put accommodations into place, they happen to be the things that tend to work for a lot of people. Flexible work and remote work are things that come to mind. That's a universal design principle in a lot of ways that allows people who have mobility challenges to participate in work. That allows parents who got to drop their kids at weird times to participate in work. People who have physical differences. All of these sorts of things, if we can be thoughtful about that, about, the large variety of people who are coming into our workplaces today and the many generations that are in our workplaces
Yeah.
today, I think, approaching work from that perspective is always the thing I want people to be thinking about too, is like, if you're making a good choice for neurodivergent people, you're probably making a good choice for everybody in a lot of ways.
Well, and I think about, I mean, I think about like policies too. It's like if something's really important, like it should be written down somewhere. But it's also like the things that are written down need to make sense and need to actually be things that are really important, right?
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
there's so many like unwritten, hidden, weird, social rules that we have in different situations or attendance rule, and it's like just write the stuff down that matters and make sure that that's reviewed with everybody, right? And then if it really doesn't matter, then it doesn't matter, and we can be flexible about this. Um,
Yeah,
so I think that
exactly.
can be helpful
Exactly.
too.
Well, if listeners take away one principle or practice from your work, you've talked about some really important kind of pieces today. What should it be? What would you want people to know or take away?
I guess the most important thing is just making sure, especially if you're working with young people, right? If you're working with teenagers, if you're working with middle schoolers, if you're working with college age students, like just don't make plans that haven't taken into account whoever that individual is, like their interests, their voice, their goals. And it's okay that you may have your own expectations, but you need to recognize like what are your expectations and what are the individual's like goals and hopes and dreams. And I think, especially if we're involved in an educational process, a special education process, a college planning process, I think we often have a lot of adults involved in those processes who have opinions, but like the reality is it's that individual's life, it's that individual's choices, it's that, and the more that we focus on the student, their voice, their choice, the more successful we are in these processes. And so I realize that's, kind of a flip from where we were talking about, like, what should employers know? but but
No.
I think it is just this idea of we need to be really listening to the individuals we're working with. We need to really be listening to our children and what matters to them. We need to teach people that when they make a choice or when they express express an opinion that matters, that counts. That doesn't mean we do what kids want all the time, but when we don't, we explain why. And that to me is such a foundational piece of transition planning. I think I end up in a lot of rooms where it's like all the adults and the students not even there. And then there's
Hmm.
that question of, well, how is the student's voice being reflected in this conversation? Do we need to reschedule this because was it just scheduled at a convenient time for all the adults? But really just thinking about like how much do we know about the student, their wants, their choices, and how much is that being empowered and raised up in the processes that we go through?
Yeah, the phrase I always work with clients to say is nothing about me without me. And I think, that holds in the workplace too, back to the employer piece a little bit too.
Yeah.
It's like, are we making decisions without consulting the people who this actually affects?
Yes.
Are we actually incorporating the voices of the people who are going to be affected by these policies? And same thing within the school setting, like you're saying, we're devising a kid's IEP. Our kids should be there in the IEP meeting.
Yes.
They should have some input onto this.
Well, and I think sometimes, when we have that conversation, an adult will say, well, they can't be here because whatever, anxiety, or because they wouldn't understand, like, but whatever your reason is for not including a student in the conversation is generally something that should be being specifically worked on with that student. Like if we're talking about an IEP meeting, it's like, great, that needs to be an IEP, an annual goal or a set of objectives that we are working on between this year and next year. Because if there's some reason that a student cannot be part of their decision making. If there are accommodations that we need to put in place for the team meeting, if it's a timing thing, like, if it's anxiety, like we need to be building whatever the skills are so that that individual can be in the meeting, can be in the decision making, because as an adult, they are going to get to make decisions and they need to be able to express those to other people, advocate for themselves, all of that. And we need to start thinking about that early and building those skills early.
It's such a great point. I think a lot of times we do things thinking we're protecting a kid in some way. We don't want to talk about their disability. They know what's going on. They experience it every day, right? They live that in the classroom. So I think having empowering conversations to talk about these things of like these are the realities, the disability that you have, or these are the realities of the way
Yeah.
your brain works and those sorts of things. And then helping them to focus on the strengths, right? Leaning into those strengths of whatever it is they have going on is so valuable because like you said, we're not raising kids, we're raising kids who will become adults, right? And we've
Yeah.
got to think about where are they going down the road with this and are we adequately preparing them for that future? I think so often well-meaning adults shield their kids from graduated exposure to the things they're going to need as adults, right? I'm not saying to
Yeah.
throw them into the deep end at 8 years old, but I do think, by stepping down the supports over time, we are empowering them to move into adulthood successfully. And when we don't do that, we're really doing a disservice to our kids.
Well, and I think we really need to think about like when are we making an ableist assumption about
Mhm.
about our child's or our students or our friends' disability. Like just even assuming that a student wouldn't want to talk about or hear about disability, like we're sort of giving into a stigma that doesn't really need to be there, and certainly we don't want to be creating additional shame for an individual by somehow shielding them for conversations or acting like it's a taboo. It's not a taboo topic. It's a legal term, right? Like, and generally many diagnoses now, come with strengths as well as some challenges. And we got to be talking about students holistically, and they have a right to be involved in conversations that are about their accommodations or the goals that they're going to need to be working on and judged on, or if we're talking about, like their medical information, like whatever it is, ultimately they own that. And so, yes, it needs to be developmentally appropriate.
Yeah.
Um, but we really have to always be thinking about how are we giving students the skills and the information they need so that they can be confident adults who get to own this information and who get to advocate for themselves.
Yeah, I think about it on the gifted side of things too, because I taught in several gifted and talented classrooms, and I was one of, I think, the few teachers, this is pretty progressive a decade ago, where we would talk about the socio-emotional side of
Yeah.
things too, of like, this might mean you're a little more sensitive to things. That might mean you're really curious about things and it's hard to put it down. And I think it's such an important conversation that we're not just talking about like kids who are ahead academically. It's not this conversation of like, you're better than other kids or some, sort of the elitist connotations of giftedness. I think when we talk about it as being a neurobiological difference, it really benefits kids because then when they arrive in adulthood, again, they don't have those weird experiences of like, I was pulled out in that weird program and I don't even know what that was about. Or they don't arrive to adulthood with these false expectations where they're like, well, I was in the gifted program, which means I've got to do everything perfectly, right? Instead, it's like, it just means my brain functioned in a different way. And like, these are some things for me to look out for. And,
Yeah.
this is part of the reason I'm really intense. And sometimes I don't feel like connect with people is just my brain's wired a little differently. Right. So I think having those honest conversations too can really benefit again, kids into their adulthood because it gives them a toolbox. It gives them, a set of phrases and terms and ways to describe themselves. We're giving them a sense of self-identity. And I think when you don't talk about those things, we're depriving kids of that aspect of themselves. And
Yes.
yet they know it's there. So it's sort of like we're pretending it's not there. We're just going to wall this part of you off. And I think that segregation of selves in some ways is what's so detrimental to kids. I think that's far
Absolutely.
worse than acknowledging you have a difference of some
Well, and anything we don't talk about, like people assume there's a reason we're not talking about it.
kind. Right.
Right? And it's just, it inherently creates feelings about something that maybe could have been a really neutral thing if we had just acknowledged it earlier. Um,
Exactly. Exactly.
yeah.
Well, Kelley, it has been so great talking with you today. I really enjoyed this conversation. Where, for the folks who are listening, where can they find you? Kind of next steps if they want to get in touch with you.
Yeah, so certainly right here on Substack is a great place to find me. I put out a weekly article, and I'm really proud of the information and the content that I'm able to put out there. And there are other wonderful
Great.
authors on here as well. So if you got here, make sure you subscribe so that you can get that weekly either in your inbox or here on Substack. I also have a website, www.challen, CHALLEN, transitions.com. That's a wonderful place to like actually be able to get on and connect with me. My email's there. There's inquiry forms there if somebody wants to set up a short informational call to learn a little bit more about different kinds of services that I offer. And then I'm on various social media. I'm old, so like I'm far better. I'm just gonna own that I'm far better at LinkedIn and at Facebook than I am at Instagram. But I'm on Instagram. If anybody wants to follow me there. And I have a YouTube channel where I post some of my short video content. So I'm kind of all places, and most places that I am, it's just Kelley Challen Transitions, which is the same as my Substack website. So feel free to look me up and follow me wherever you're comfortable following people, even though I'm clearly more comfortable with some some types of media.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I certainly highly recommend planning beyond the IEP. I've learned so many wonderful things from Kelley's Substack, too. And again, excellent place to get evidence-based work too. There are a lot of things out there that are just sort of people's conjecture, and Kelley really goes to the evidence, which I really appreciate. So highly, highly recommend that. But thank you again, Kelley, for being here. It was great to connect with you. And I hope we'll get to do this again soon.
Absolutely. And I'm glad we got to talk about your curriculum and the workbook that you've put out. And I want to just say, it's like Emily and I found each other because Emily is also sharing incredible content, is an educator, right? Has the experience, has the training to be sharing some of the knowledge that she's sharing. And so definitely, if you happen to get here because you were following me, make sure that you're following Emily. Make sure that you take a look at her workbook because it's really been an honor to speak with you today, but it's been really exciting to get to read different posts that you've put out. And I'm just really, it's nice when you find like-minded people, but I just appreciate that you're doing really good work. And that's so
Thank
important.
you. Thank you. Yeah, if folks want more information about that, you can find me at beyondgiftedservices.com. My workbook is the Curious Career Workbook. It's available on Amazon. Then you can also get it on my website at beyondgiftedservices.com. All right. Well, have a good rest of your day, Kelley. It was great speaking with you. And thanks to everybody who tuned in.
Absolutely. Have a great weekend. Take care.
Bye bye.